Welcome back to Sunday Morning Cafe, our ongoing conversation on building and maintaining resilience during difficult times. Today we'll be discussing topics of grief and loss in a way that if you would have said 3 months ago you're going to talk about this topic, I wouldn't have guessed how I'd go about it, but that's what we'll do today. I'd like to begin this topic by going to a researcher whose work I've cited in these videos a couple of different times. Lawrence Gonzalez wrote a book, Deep Survival, in which he gave a report on the research he did when he interviewed many survivors of nature accidents to find out what they might have had in common that would allow for their survival. Well, so one of the topics he came up with was kind of surprising. He discovered that people who survived nature accidents were willing to engage in a grieving process and did engage in a grieving process. And like me, you might be thinking, well, why would that be? It looked like this. Those who didn't survive might have gone for a walk from the ski lodge, and on their walk they realized, I'm not getting back to, and nothing looks familiar. Without a grieving process where they feel the pain of that, the anger of that, they just keep walking thinking, well, I'm on a walk, I just got to go faster and harder at what I was doing. Those willing to engage in that grieving process go, oh, crap, I am lost. And engaging in that grieving process and acknowledging that allows them then to be able to get through that process and take action. I better build a shelter. While there's still some sun out, I better melt some snow so I have something to drink later on tonight. I like to think of it like this, the grieving process, and I've learned this through 3 decades of working with clients over the years. I think of a picture on a wall that I have there because I like it. I like exactly where it is. I like what's in that picture. But doesn't it happen in our lives from time to time where that picture's got to come down and a picture I don't like's got to get put on that wall? I call that the grieving process. This thing that I loved or this person I loved has now gone away and I didn't ask for it and I don't like it. I've got to acknowledge that picture's got to come down, and I got to take this picture I don't even like and put it up. The process we go through, the emotional process we go through, we call that the grieving process. Like I said in the beginning, 3 months ago, if you would have told me how I'd be approaching this topic today, I wouldn't have guessed it. When this pandemic started, I could see this thing coming at me over the hill, and I could have guessed the kinds of loss that people, including myself, would probably experience. But then I heard this name in media here a few weeks ago, Ahmaud Arbery, who I'd never heard of before. Someone who was tracked down and was killed. And the next thing you know, I hear this name I never knew before, George Floyd, another person who was killed. And suddenly, there's this kind of dramatic experience of a collective unhealed wound that's here in a way that I didn't expect. And I'm going to admit something to you. There are many, many of us in our culture who'd say it never went away. They were living that unhealed wound every day in so many different ways. And if I'm you, I might be thinking, well, here's this series on resilience we've been talking about. How is this plugging into resilience, this topic that Tom is surfacing right here, this painful topic? Let me get at that with you. In my profession of counseling psychology, probably before the 1990s, maybe somewhere in the 80s, here's what we used to think. If somebody had a problem emotionally or psychologically or maybe with an addiction, we'd try to get inside that person to see what is that thing inside that makes sense of these symptoms that are here, as if it's inside the person. In my own PhD studies in family systems theory, what we began to see was that's not sufficient. The relationships that hold this person in place or fail to hold this person in place has to be assessed to understand how this person's doing and what's going on in this person's life. Well, and if that's true of like the family that they're in or the relationships they're in, it also extends out to the community that they live in. And so, for instance, by now everybody knows that the fact that we live in a culture that keeps feeding us pictures of skinny women has something to do with the horrible eating disorders that show up in our girls and our women. Now that just seems like common sense. Now think about this. When somebody lives in a food desert, where there's no economic opportunity, where a tax base cannot pay for good schools, over time you think that could lead to depression. Do you think that could lead to anxiety or problems in education? We begin to notice the systemic context in which people live. Now, I'm saying this to you and you might be thinking, Tom, that insight is about as old as the poet John Donne saying, no man, no woman is an island. We all live in this seamless web of destiny. Some of you might have studied early 20th century scholarship like Carl Jung in psychology, who noticed the collective unconscious. We are connected at a profound level. Max Shaler in existential psychology. When one of us moves to authenticity, it has a way of pulling all of us toward authenticity, and the other way around. From a religious sphere, Pope Pius, in his document, The Mystical Body of Christ, said even if somebody's not Christian, they're part of this body that's all connected at a soul level. And so what I'm getting at is this. If we want to be resilient as individuals, we cannot not pay attention to a body that's got a wound in it. It's going to impact us. At a subtle level and a not so subtle level, it will impact us. So paying attention to and addressing that wound that's in the body participates in our own resilience work. And so my invitation, that first step I'm inviting us to do, is to not shy away from wholeheartedly stepping into a grieving process when it comes to what's happening in this body that we live in, our society. But let me issue a warning before you take that step, because any of you who've actually done real grieving understand something. It is sloppy work. Back in the 70s, when the research was first published by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, you could read her books and come away thinking that it's a neat, tidy, stepwise project. Here's one discrete phase called denial. When the denial lifts, we have this thing called bargaining, then comes the anger, and after the anger comes the sadness, and after the sadness comes the acceptance, and that's when the peace comes. But anybody who's really been through grief knows better. It comes like a swirl. It comes with all those things, including confusion, including identity confusion, including sadness, and yes, anger too. And I think that's something that's awfully off-putting for people. We aren't usually raised to be comfortable with anger. But if you skip over the anger in the grieving process, you won't heal. Anger makes a good stepping stone in healing, makes a lousy destination point. If someone's stuck in anger, that's a complex grief, and hopefully there are resources to help in that part of it. But, you know, to skip over that is to avoid real healing. So there's some do's and don'ts that you probably already know about that I'm just going to fly through real quick. To step into this grieving process, you know already. You've got to accept the feelings as they come, one day at a time. And like a river, allow them to pass through you non-judgmentally, kind of ask yourself what they're connected to. You know that already, don't you? The other thing to be aware of is we need our warm-hearted friendships to connect to, where we're having those conversations in a deep, warm-hearted way. With this particular type of grief, I would ask you to pay attention to who you choose to be those warm-hearted friendships. Some relationships provide more heat than light on this issue. Take care if you notice that. Another unique thing to this moment is choose carefully your media sources. Again, those sources that stoke anger and stoke fear are to be avoided, because who needs the anxiety and the depression that's already there for so many of us? Why do we need to have more of that fed to us? And those social media outlets that pit one against the other, which, by the way, another thing with this particular type of grief I'm talking about, I remember some years ago, my daughter Annalise, I was so proud of her. She went to a protest, because there she was I think it was in high school at the time, and she wanted to do something. So I told this colleague of mine, yeah, she went to this protest, and my colleague said, does she and your family, do you guys hate cops? No, I don't hate cops. I've got cops for clients. I've got cops for friends. I love cops. Be careful, because in these times, there is this either-or thinking out there where people want to leave out a part and be for another part. That's not necessary. Let's avoid dualistic thinking as we make this approach. Are there police forces that need reform? You bet there are. When four guys are standing here watching one dude with his knee on somebody's neck and they're not saying, hey, step off, we'll take care of this, that's a police training issue. And there are probably there are many police forces that need reform, but which of our institutions don't need reform when it comes to this issue? Another thing I want to say is, did you ever see that, that bumper sticker that's taken out of Matthew's Gospel but changed ever so slightly that goes, for when I was hungry, you formed a discussion group. I am not inviting you and I into a grieving process to merely go through a set of emotions so we can feel good about going through a set of emotions. Back to Lawrence Gonzalez. The reason those people survived who were willing to enter into the grieving process is because it woke them up to the picture that was on the wall instead of the one they wish was there. It woke them up to that. And the next thing they could do was an action that could increase their chances of living, even just one action. By paying attention and moving through this grieving process and all the sloppiness it entails, which, by the way, for a guy like me means I get it wrong pretty often. In my effort to be an ally to somebody who's black, for instance, I've said things I had to apologize for because they had to say, Tom, that's not helpful. And I wanted to get defensive. Well, I'm trying, you know. Far better to take that humility that says, look, I'm sorry. I'm new to this kind of stuff. I have the privilege of being able to get to be new to it, but I'm here wanting to enter into that grieving process. So to follow Lawrence Gonzalez's advice is to step into that, go through the painful emotional process so that organically the action that suits my insides, that comes from my heart, can be taken to begin to heal this body that we're in. And from a counselor's standpoint, those actions are a profound form of behavioral therapy that lead to the kinds of interchanges that bring some nice things to a person's life. Those of you who have wholeheartedly engaged a grieving process, I invite you into this particular type of grief, because what you remember is to wholeheartedly engage a grieving process is to be available to an accumulated source of layers of wisdom, is to be available to enhanced and deepened relationships, and is to eventually know a kind of peace that can exist alongside anxiety, that can exist alongside sadness, and can exist alongside an anger that's hard to understand. So that brings us to the end of our conversation for today. Please join us next week for a kind of solidarity as we explore these issues and dig into them a little more deeply.